I'm going to say a few words about Larry, a little more about the gospel, and conclude by talking a little bit about this holy table. Larry was one of the few people I ever went fishing with other than my father. And my father used to say that you got to know people when you went fishing with them. And even though I only fished with Larry twice, and neither Jane nor Marty were optimistic about the outcome of that experience, I did get to know Larry. We talked about a lot of things, bobbing around on Table Rock Lake in his boat. And I also got to know him through the beginnings of his illness, even though at that time I didn't realize he was ill. And I know now the challenges he must have faced and the difficulties he encountered. And I know the things that he had to give up and stop doing. We talked about cutting down a tree, but the better angels prevented us from doing that because it was the time when that would have been dangerous for Larry to have done, and probably for me as well. And I know that Larry had a faith, and it was a faith that I'll talk about a little bit more in the gospel reading when I get to that. But most of all, I know that Larry was surrounded by people who genuinely loved him and cared for him and were committed to keeping him safe when he could no longer do that. And that includes the people who are here today, those of you who are friends, members of this congregation, people who worked with Marty, who supported them, and especially began to intervene whenever possible to help over those last few years before they moved to Cedar Falls. Jane and I went to Cedar Falls, and while I'm glad we went and we got to see them, it was less than 10 days before Larry died. And so he was in a pretty bad state at the time. He was still at home. We were able to sit by him, talk with him, but his responses were minimal. We're not sure he really knew who we were. That was okay. But we did get to sit at the table with him. And I'll also talk a little bit about that at the end of this homily. I said I wanted to say a little more about the gospel. I didn't ask Marty why she chose this particular reading. It's one of the options for readings at a funeral service, and all of the gospel readings are from John. And there are probably lots of good reasons for that. But in this gospel reading particularly comes that troubling phrase where Jesus says, "No one comes to the Father but by me." And that phrase has been used as an exclusionary phrase by Christians for many, many years as a way of saying, well, you're out and we're in. And Larry Johnson would have been the last person who would have believed that, except maybe Marty. And they would have been in good standing, because that is not what the church teaches about this gospel. This gospel is not intended to be exclusive, but inclusive. When Jesus says, "No one comes to the Father but by me," he is talking about his work when he leaves his earthly life and goes to heaven and intercedes for all of us and all of creation, which is to be redeemed. And that's the theory and theology in John's whole gospel, is the redemption of all creation, of all human beings, of all people. So do not understand this gospel as a limiting piece, but understand it as very good news indeed, that God seeks us all out, and it is Jesus who brings us home, even if we do not know him by name. And I rejoice in that, and rejoice that Larry embraced that gospel. Now I want to talk a little bit about this table, but to do that I want to talk about that last meal we had with Larry and Marty and their daughter Susan and Larry's daughter Donna, gathered around the table in their home. Somebody cooked a really lovely lasagna, and Larry was able to come to the table and he ate some of it. And even though he wasn't conversing with us, he was there and present. And I had this flash of insight that this was not the last meal we would have with Larry. That there is another meal. And it takes place in paradise, but this is one end of that table. And so I want to invite all of you to come to the table today, not because you're just taking communion, but because we're participating with the saints in heaven who are at the other end of that table, and Larry's there. And I hope you will rejoice in that and take that to heart, because that's what this service is really about. It's not about being sad. Of course we're sad, but it's about rejoicing in what God has promised and given us. So celebrate with us, rejoice with us, and then as an additional piece of that fellowship, we're going to have some very simple refreshments downstairs afterwards. There'll be some coffee. I heard a rumor there might be a slice of cake or two. And you can come down and share stories about Larry that you would like to share, and just talk and visit for a few moments. So please feel free to stay after the service today. Now, one more thing. I hope you signed the register. If you didn't, be sure and sign it on your way out, because we're going to share that with Marty so she will know who was here, because that's very important to her. And again, I want to tell you how grateful I am for all of you for coming. Those of you who worked really hard to get this service to happen. Many people gave their time and talent on a busy holiday weekend to make sure it took place. And for that, I am grateful indeed. And Marty is most grateful indeed. She wants to come and visit, but she says, now I don't feel like I have to do it right away. I can do it at a time of my choosing. So you'll hear from her, I'm sure. We'll know when she's